In the 1960s, being a Formula One driver meant playing with death, and death almost always won. During the peak of Jackie Stewart's career in the late 1960s and early 1970s, anyone who raced continuously had a 2 out of 3 chance of dying. 29 Formula One drivers were killed in the 1960s alone. Drivers smoked cigarettes before races, drove without proper seatbelts, and raced on circuits lined with telegraph poles and wooden barriers soaked in fuel. Safety wasn't just ignored, it was mocked. Speaking out about danger was seen as weakness. But one man refused to accept this madness. A quiet Scotsman who would not only dominate the sport with 3 world championships and 27 victories, but would tear down the very culture that made heroes into statistics. This is the story of Jackie Stewart, the man who invented the modern racing driver by daring to believe that survival was not cowardice. But before we tell Stewart's story, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to witness is how one man challenged an entire industry that accepted death as normal, and won. This was not paranoia. This was reality. In the 1950s alone, 15 drivers were killed in Formula One-related activities, championship races, testing sessions, and non-championship events. 5-time world champion Juan Manuel Fangio recorded in his autobiography that over his 10-year career, 30 of his fellow competitors died in motor racing accidents. The 1960s would prove even deadlier. 14 drivers were killed during that decade. Only 2 years, 1963 and 1965, passed without a fatality. But death wasn't just common. It was normalized. Drivers were expected to courageously confront such potentially perilous risks as an integral part of a manly challenge. Fire claimed many victims. John Taylor, Lorenzo Bandini, and Joe Schlesser all burned to death in the 1960s. The cars themselves were death traps. Until 1967, there were no mandatory safety regulations requiring fire-resistant clothing or shatterproof visors. Seat belt anchorages were only standardized in the mid-1960s. Medical facilities at circuits were primitive at best. Crash barriers were often non-existent. And anyone who dared complain was dismissed as weak. Into this world stepped Jackie Stewart, a young Scotsman who would soon learn the price of this arrogance written in blood on a Belgian racetrack. John Young Stewart was born on June 11, 1939, in Milton, Dunbartonshire, Scotland, into a family already immersed in motorsport. His father owned a garage business, and his older brother Jimmy was the first in the family to try racing, though their mother disapproved. But Jackie's path seemed destined for failure. He suffered from severe undiagnosed dyslexia that made school a living nightmare. Unable to read or write properly, he was considered a complete failure by his teachers and left school at age 15 with no qualifications whatsoever. He went to work as a mechanic in his father's garage, seemingly destined for an ordinary life. Only years later would doctors diagnose his dyslexia, making everything he would go on to achieve even more remarkable. Looking for something he could excel at, the teenage Stewart took up clay pigeon shooting. And here, finally, he found success. He became one of the best shots in Britain, winning the British, Irish, Welsh, and Scottish skeet shooting championships. He twice won the Coupe des Nations European Championship. In 1960, at just 21 years old, he competed for a place in the British trap shooting team for the Summer Olympics, finishing third and narrowly missing qualification. The precision, the split-second timing, the absolute control required in competitive shooting would soon translate to something far more dangerous. When his brother Jimmy suffered a serious accident in 1963, the family needed someone to test drive their racing cars. Jackie volunteered. Ken Tyrrell, who was running a Formula Junior team, heard about the young Scotsman from Goodwood's track manager and called Jimmy to ask if his younger brother was interested in a tryout. Stewart came down to Goodwood to test a new Formula 3 Cooper T72 BMC that Bruce McLaren was already testing. Soon, Stewart was beating McLaren's times. McLaren returned to the track for quicker laps. Again, Stewart was faster. Tyrrell offered him a spot on the team immediately. His debut race in Formula 3 came at Snetterton on March 15, 1964, in the rain. Stewart took a 25-second lead in just 2 laps, then coasted home to win by 44 seconds. Within days, he was offered a Formula 1 ride with Cooper but declined, preferring to gain experience under Tyrrell's guidance. He failed to win just 2 races that season, one due to clutch failure, one to a spin, and became Formula 3 champion. By 1965, BRM signed him alongside Graham Hill for £4,000, though his very first F1 race was actually for Lotus in December 1964, substituting for an injured Jim Clark at the non-championship Ran Grand Prix. He took pole position, won the second heat, and set the fastest lap. His official World Championship debut came in South Africa in 1965, where he finished 6th. But it was at Monza, in the Italian Grand Prix later that year, where Jackie Stewart announced himself to the world, fighting wheel-to-wheel with his own teammate Graham Hill and taking his first Grand Prix victory. He finished his rookie season 3rd in the World Drivers' Championship with 1 win, 3 second places, a 3rd, a 5th, and a 6th. The racing world saw a fast, calculating driver with ice-cold precision and almost robotic consistency. What they didn't yet see was the revolutionary. That transformation would require something more than victory. It would require surviving what should have killed him. The 1966 season had started with promise. Stewart won the Monaco Grand Prix in May, his second career victory. He was also competing at the Indianapolis 500 for the first time, where he led by over a lap with only 8 laps remaining before a broken scavenge pump ended his race, but not before earning him Rookie of the Year honors. But his BRM was unreliable. The new 3-liter H16 engine was a catastrophe. Stewart would finish only 5 of the 19 races he started in 1966 and 1967 combined. Then came June 12, 1966. The Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps. Spa was already one of the most dangerous circuits in the world, a 14-kilometer monster through the Ardennes forest with no runoff areas, lined with trees, telegraph poles, and farmhouses. And on that Sunday, it was raining. On the first lap, at the Mastekink, a blind downhill, 160-mile-per-hour corner, Stewart's BRM aquaplaned on a river of water. He lost control completely. The car smashed through a woodcutter's hut, a telegraph pole, and a barn before coming to rest upside down in a ditch filled with water and fuel. Stewart was trapped. Pinned inside the cockpit, soaked in gasoline, with the steering wheel jammed against his chest. The car's battery was shorting out, sparking dangerously near the fuel. And there was no one to help him. No marshals arrived. No medical team. No fire extinguishers. The race continued without interruption. Fellow drivers Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant saw the wreckage and stopped. They ran to the car and found Stewart conscious but unable to move. Hill ran to a spectator's truck and borrowed a toolbox. Using a spanner, Hill and Bondurant worked frantically to remove the steering wheel so they could extract Stewart from the wreckage. It took them 25 minutes. 25 minutes lying in fuel and water, trapped in a mangled car, waiting for a spark that could turn him into a fireball. When they finally pulled him out, there was no ambulance. They loaded Stewart into the back of a van and drove him to the medical center, which turned out to be nothing more than a first aid room with no doctors present. He was eventually taken to a hospital in Liege. Stewart had suffered a broken collarbone, broken ribs, and was deeply traumatized. But the physical injuries were nothing compared to what that accident did to his mind. Lying in that crushed car, drenched in gasoline, waiting to burn alive while the race went on without him. That was the moment everything changed. As Stewart would later say, "I realized then that this was not bravery. This was stupidity." The system that demanded silence was about to meet the one man who would not stay quiet. Stewart returned to racing. But he was no longer the same man who had climbed into that BRM at Spa. The 1967 season was miserable. He finished only 2 of 11 races, retiring 9 times with mechanical failures. He managed a 3rd place in France and a 2nd in Belgium, but finished 9th in the championship with just 10 points. He also returned to Indianapolis in 1967, but an engine problem ended his race after 168 laps. But while his results suffered, something else was awakening. Stewart began to speak publicly about safety, and the racing establishment was horrified. He demanded proper medical facilities at circuits. He insisted on crash barriers that could actually protect drivers, not wooden fences soaked in advertising banners. He wanted fire extinguishers, trained marshals, ambulances with doctors on standby. He called for mandatory seat belts, something so basic it seems absurd it wasn't already required. At the first Canadian Grand Prix in 1967 at Motorsport, Stewart was the only driver in the entire field wearing seat belts. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Fellow drivers accused him of cowardice. Team owners said he was bad for business, scaring away sponsors and fans. Race organizers called him a troublemaker. The prevailing attitude was summarized by one journalist who wrote that drivers should courageously confront such potentially perilous risks as an integral part of a manly challenge. Real men, they insisted, didn't complain about danger. Stewart didn't care. Over the course of his 11-year racing career in Formula 3, Formula 2, and Formula 1, he would watch 57 of his fellow competitors die. The cold reality of the 1960s and 1970s was brutal. A driver competing in F1 for 5 years was statistically more likely to die than to retire. He began carrying tools in his car, a wrench taped to the steering column, because he knew if he crashed, no one would be equipped to rescue him. He walked circuits before races, pointing out deadly hazards to organizers who didn't want to hear it. He refused to race at tracks he deemed unsafe, risking his championship chances. And slowly, grudgingly, some began to listen. For 1968, Stewart made a crucial decision. He left BRM and reunited with Ken Tyrrell, now running Matra International with Ford Cosworth Power. It was a partnership that would change everything. Stewart took a prominent role in managing the team, negotiating with sponsors, leading presentations to Ford and Goodyear, professionalizing every aspect of the operation. Mark Hughes described him as a different sort of F1 driver to any that had been seen before. On track, he was devastating. The 1968 season was a revelation. With the Matra MS-10 and Ken Tyrrell's precise management, Stewart became unstoppable. He won 3 races that year: the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort in torrential rain, the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring in conditions that can only be described as apocalyptic, and the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. He finished 2nd in the championship with 36 points, losing only to Graham Hill's 48. But it was the German Grand Prix on August 4, 1968, that cemented Stewart's legend. The Nürburgring Nordschleife, 14 miles through the Eifel Mountains with 73 corners, no runoff areas, and lined with trees and rocks. And it rained for 3 straight days. Visibility was down to 200 yards. It was a race that should never have started. Stewart qualified fastest in the wet session. When the race began, he couldn't see anything through the wall of spray. By the end of the first lap, he was already 8 seconds ahead. After 2 laps, his lead was 34 seconds. He won by 4 minutes and 3 seconds. When he returned to the pits, his first question to Ken Tyrrell was, "Who died?" When Tyrrell answered nobody, it felt like a curse had been broken. Jim Clark had been killed 4 months earlier in April, and the sport had been haunted ever since. For 1969, Stewart and Tyrrell moved to the new Matra MS-80. This time, there would be no second place. Stewart won 6 races that season: South Africa, Spain, Netherlands, France, Great Britain, and Italy. He clinched his first world championship at Monza with 63 points, 26 points ahead of his nearest rival, Jackie Stewart. He had become not just a champion, but a complete professional. While other drivers lived like rock stars, partying, drinking, treating racing as a gentleman's hobby, Stewart treated it as a business. He revolutionized sponsorship deals, managed his public image carefully, maintained strict physical fitness, and controlled every aspect of his career. He was building the template that every modern Formula One driver would follow, from Alain Prost to Michael Schumacher to Lewis Hamilton. But his revolution wasn't finished yet. While Stewart was winning races and championships, his real battle was being fought off the track. By 1970, his relentless campaigning was beginning to break through decades of resistance. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of confrontation, public pressure, and the mounting body count to finally force change. Stewart demanded that every race have trained medical teams, ambulances with proper equipment, and helicopters for immediate evacuation. He called for the removal of the most dangerous circuits from the calendar. Seat belts became mandatory. 5-point and 6-point harnesses were introduced. Full-face helmets replaced the open-face designs that left drivers' faces exposed. Fuel cells were developed to prevent explosions on impact. The Grand Prix Drivers Association, which Stewart actively supported, gained power and influence. Drivers could now collectively refuse to race at unsafe circuits without being blacklisted. The results were undeniable. In the 1960s, 14 drivers were killed during the F1 World Championship decade. In the 1970s, despite Stewart's activism, 12 more would still die, including his close friend and protégé François Savert. But the trend was shifting. By the 1980s, fatalities dropped significantly. And from 1994 to 2014, spanning 20 years, only 3 drivers died in F1-related incidents, and 2 of those were in the same tragic weekend at Imola in 1994. Today, a driver can walk away from a 200 miles per hour crash that would have been instantly fatal in Stewart's era. The survival cell, the Hans device, the halo, every piece of modern safety equipment exists because one man refused to accept that death was the price of speed. Meanwhile, on the track, Stewart was still dominating. The 1970 season was difficult. Matra refused to use Ford engines, insisting Stewart drive their V12. Stewart refused and left, forcing Ken Tyrrell to buy March chassis while developing his own car. Stewart won only Spain that year and finished 5th in the championship with 25 points as Johan Rindt won posthumously after being killed at Monza. But 1971 would be different. In 1971, driving the new Tyrrell 003, Stewart was unstoppable. He won 6 races: Spain, Monaco, France, Great Britain, Germany, and Canada. He finished the championship with 62 points, 29 ahead of second-place Ronnie Peterson. It was his second world championship, and he achieved it while battling mononucleosis and crossing the Atlantic Ocean 186 times for media commitments. In 1972, gastritis forced him to miss the Belgian Grand Prix, but he still won 4 races: Argentina, France, United States, and Canada, finishing second to Emerson Fittipaldi in the championship. That same year, he was awarded the OB by Queen Elizabeth II. Then came 1973, his final season. Stewart won 5 more races: South Africa, Belgium, Monaco, Netherlands, and Germany. By the time the circus arrived at Watkins Glen for the United States Grand Prix in October, he had already clinched his third World Championship. It would have been his 100th Grand Prix, a milestone he had planned to mark by retiring immediately afterward. But on Saturday, October 6th, during practice, his teammate and protégé François Savert crashed at the notorious uphill SE section. The car was torn apart. Savert was killed instantly. Stewart was devastated. He had mentored Savert, guided him, watched him grow into one of the sport's brightest talents. The young Frenchman had won the previous year's United States Grand Prix at the same circuit. Ken Tyrrell immediately withdrew the team from the race. Stewart never started his 100th Grand Prix. He retired with 27 victories from 99 starts, a win rate of 27.27%. He had taken 17 pole positions and set 15 fastest laps. 3 World Championships. 2 Indianapolis 500 Rookie of the Year awards. But the numbers don't tell the real story. As Stewart later explained, Savert was like a son to me. When he died, I realized I had done everything I could. I had won my championships. I had my family waiting at home. And I understood that the truly brave thing wasn't to keep racing, it was to know when to stop. He walked away at 34 years old, at the peak of his abilities. And in doing so, he made one final statement, that a driver could choose life over glory. Jackie Stewart didn't disappear from Formula One after retirement. He became a television commentator, bringing his analytical mind and passion for safety to millions of viewers. In 1997, he returned as a team owner, founding Stewart Grand Prix with his son Paul. The team achieved its greatest moment in 1999 when Johnny Herbert won the European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, and Rubens Barrichello took pole position at the French Grand Prix, helping the team finish fourth in the Constructors' Championship. At the end of 1999, facing financial difficulties, Stewart sold the team to Ford, which eventually became Jaguar Racing and later evolved into today's Red Bull Racing. He was knighted in 2001 by Queen Elizabeth II for his services to motorsport, not just for his championships, but for saving countless lives. After John Surtees's death in 2017, Stewart became the last surviving Formula One world champion from the 1960s and the oldest living Grand Prix winner. Today, at 86 years old, he continues as a Rolex ambassador since 1968 and remains active in advocating for dementia awareness after his wife Helen was diagnosed with the condition. But his true legacy isn't measured in trophies or records. Every driver who walks away from a 200 miles per hour crash. Every medical helicopter that lands within minutes of an accident. Every fire-resistant suit, every safety barrier, every piece of equipment designed to protect rather than simply restrain, all of it exists because one man refused to accept that dying was part of the job. The modern generation of drivers doesn't know death the way Stewart's generation did. As he himself said, the modern generation doesn't know death. That's the greatest achievement, that they can race without having to say goodbye to their friends before every race. Jackie Stewart won 3 World Championships, 27 races. He set records that stood for years. But his greatest victory wasn't on the track. It was teaching Formula One that speed without safety isn't bravery, it's stupidity. He raced in an era that killed heroes. And he survived to ensure that the next generation wouldn't have to.